The year is 2019. Disney comes one step closer to world domination. NASA's first image of a black hole confirms that they do indeed look like holes that are black, and acclaimed director Martin Scorsese comes under some fire for comparing Marvel movies to theme park attractions. And I mean, I get it, but come on now, he could have said worse. Have you ever been to a theme park? I mean, those things are fun as hell. Or maybe he was referring to the queues that build up outside cinemas to see these movies, comparable to those you see at a theme park. The confectionery, maybe? Popcorn and nachos wouldn't be too out of place in a fairground after all. Do the similarities between amusement parks and cinemas really surprise anyone? After all, the early cinema industry was pretty much conceived as a cheap novelty attraction for the unwashed masses. The mid-1890s to the early 1910s were a tremendously exciting period in early filmmaking, as this period saw unbelievable innovation in both narrative and technical aspects of cinema. By the onset of the First World War, both Europe and the United States had developed impressive film industries, and the growing market for these industries, as well as the growing complexity and runtimes of the films they produced, legitimized the requirement for dedicated film venues as opposed to temporary sites, shared theater spaces, or literal theme park amusement tents. It was a wild period in film experimentation, and it must have seemed like the originality would never run out. It was too bad then that the originality had been running out since 1896. Okay, look, maybe I'm being a bit hyperbolic when comparing 19th century remakes to the amorphous grey blob of content we get today. Early filmmakers were still discovering the medium, and the novelty of seeing moving images being projected before an audience must have been nothing short of pure magic. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that if I plonk a camera down at Houston Station for 30 seconds that I've suddenly remade the Lumiere's train pulling into a station. Likewise, it'd be foolish to decide that The Chimney Sweep and The Miller is a remake of The Miller and the Chimney Sweep, or that Playing Cards is a remake of a card game. These very early films barely reach a minute in length and depict ordinary, mundane actions more than they resemble anything close to an original narrative. But it is interesting to think about the way in which films were distributed back in the inception of the industry, and how the very nature of this distribution bred plagiarism and piracy. You see, back then, films weren't sold as completed products. Once a film was sold to a distributor, the film's producers essentially gave up the right to dictate how that film was presented to an audience. Of course, the director could provide recommendations on the speed of the film and the sound which would accompany it, but the final say in this ultimately rested with the distributor or exhibitor, as well as any changes they wished to make in terms of colorization and editing, snipping the reel to reorganize scenes or omit them entirely. Such loose regulations surrounding film distribution and ownership meant that piracy and bootlegging were not uncommon at this time, and some of the most important early filmmakers of all time found themselves coming up with new methods of protecting their films from being copied or tampered with. As a famous example, renowned early French filmmaker Georges Méliès edited a lot of his multi-scene films with dissolved transitions, which made it harder for distributors to re-edit scenes. As one of the most prolific and important filmmakers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Méliès' films were often subject to heavy piracy by international figures. Take, for example, Sigmund Lubin, an American pioneer of filmmaking whose manufacturing company sold many illegal prints of Méliès' films. Perhaps most famously, Méliès' 1902 magnum opus A Trip to the Moon was illegally copied, sold, and distributed in the US as A Trip to Mars 1 year later in 1903. But this brief window into early film distribution focuses more on piracy and bootlegging, not genuine film remakes, which did still exist at the time, more so than just reshooting the same 30 seconds of film and slapping a new director's name on the title card. Once films became longer, more complex, multi-scene narratives, it became easier to distinguish films inspired by previous successes and outright copycat films. And one of the earliest examples of this was a 1908 remake of one of the most famous and influential films of that period, and indeed, of all time. I recently read a fascinating book about this period of cinema history called Fantastic Voyages of the Cinematic Imagination. The book heavily focuses on Méliès' filmography and contribution to early special effects, but one chapter of the book really stood out to me and is more or less what inspired this video in the first place. The chapter in question focuses on different presentational methods of filmmaking, the theatrical method and the narrative method. Both are relatively straightforward enough to comprehend. Narrativity is the desire to first and foremost tell a narrative through the art of the moving image, and present it in a way which is unique to cinema through the process of editing. Theatricality is similar, yet presents its narratives in such a way which imitates theatrical patterns and norms. Think theatrical sets, set entrances and exits, and the imagined audience. Although Méliès borrowed aspects from both methods, his general filmography seems to adopt an alternative method entirely, one which, from his history as a showman and illusionist, makes perfect sense. Although elements of his films clearly draw from theatricality and narrativity, neither were the priority of Méliès when making his films. Méliès saw cinema as a new method to inspire his audiences with tricks and illusions which would traditionally be impossible to pull off. As such, he began his filmmaking process with these tricks in mind. Afterwards, he would then decide on an era during which his chosen trick would be most profound. Then the costumes would be designed, followed by the sets. Only at the very end of the process would the narrative be developed. Quote, "As for the script, the fable, the tale in itself, I worked this out at the very end, and I can therefore state that, done thus, the script was without any importance, since my only aim was to use it as an excuse for mise-en-scène, for tricks, or for tableau with a pleasing effect." End quote. It's clear that narrative for Méliès was simply a means to an end, a framework through which his tricks could be presented to an audience. Where other filmmakers were defining themselves through theatricality, documentary, or narrativity, Méliès was focusing on spectacle and illusionism which would define his entire filmmaking career. He sold audiences spectacles with the narrative sprinkled throughout, not vice versa, giving rise to perhaps a third method of filmmaking, trickality. You probably recognise this shot. Even if you don't know exactly where it's from, the image of the rocket crashing into the eye of the man on the moon has become synonymous with early 20th century filmmaking and is one of the most striking and iconic images of the entire history of cinema. This is 1902's A Trip to the Moon, widely regarded as Méliès' masterpiece and a landmark achievement in the development of cinema. The 260-metre-long film is widely regarded as the first science fiction film ever made, showcasing massive breakthroughs in special effects and editing. The satirical film revolves around a group of astronomers who plan a daring mission to land on the moon. A capsule-shaped rocket ship is constructed and fired into space through a giant cannon, eventually landing on the moon. Upon exiting the craft, the astronomers sleep, with numerous extraterrestrial and mythological beings looking down upon them as they slumber. Once they awaken, the astronomers seek shelter in a cave where they are confronted by alien creatures known as Selenites. The astronomers are captured and brought to the Selenite king, who they eventually overpower and defeat. The astronomers flee the cave, pursued by angry Selenites, until reaching the safety of their spacecraft. The capsule tilts precariously on a cliffside before falling, plummeting down to Earth. In the final scene, a celebratory parade is held for the brave astronomers, where a captured Selenite is displayed and made to dance for the crowd's amusement, while a statue is unveiled depicting the astronomers' conquest over the foreign land. The story is predictably a simple one, yet the anti-imperialist and scientific parody satire are all still striking and plain to see. However, in pure Méliès fashion, the real allure of the show are the tricks, the illusions and spectacles that are on display throughout. You've got men turning telescopes into schools, you have the firing of the capsule into space through a cannon, you've got the capsule landing on the moon twice, a deliberate continuity error which further removes this film from traditional narrative conventions. You have the Earth rising in the distance as the stars with faces look down on our heroes, accompanied by the gods and goddesses of ancient myth, umbrellas turning into mushrooms and growing before our very eyes as the astronomers evaporate the Selenites with these very same umbrellas. The in-between bits don't particularly matter very much, as the film is very much a showcase of different special effects designed to inspire and awe a crowd. It's a magic show on film. It was never designed to be scrutinised as just a narrative picture with stunts, which may be part of the reason why the 1908 remake, Excursion to the Moon, is remembered far less fondly by comparison. Excursion to the Moon is Spanish filmmaker Segundo de Chamoun's own take on Méliès' classic. Released 6 years after Trip to the Moon, the film is essentially a shot-for-shot remake of the original for much of its runtime. Despite the shorter length, with the film just being 180 meters long, Chamoun's remake manages to fly through the same beats and special effects as the original, and even adds what you could call a more traditional ending to its narrative. The differences between the two films are negligible at best, with the most notable differences being that the moon swallows the capsule-shaped rocket instead of being hit in the eye, the noticeably more peaceful interactions between the protagonist and the Selenites, and the added narrative thread of one of the protagonists falling for a Selenite princess, providing the narrative with traditional closure that Méliès' version may have been lacking, but also stripping the original of its anti-imperialist and political satire in the process. Watching Excursion to the Moon is an unusual experience after seeing Méliès' classic. The differences between the two films are so minute that at times it almost feels like watching the same film. Not only that, but one could say that it misses the point of the original entirely by not feeling like a trick film at all. The effects and stunts, while still astonishing for the time period, are given less time to unfold and inspire the audience, more or less negating the entire purpose of Méliès' original film. Now, don't get me wrong, not every film about explorers going to the moon is a remake or rip-off of Trip to the Moon, but when the similarities are so noticeable and on the nose, it's hard to imagine that this movie was made for any other reason than to piggyback off the tremendous success and popularity of the original, preying off the goodwill and trust of an audience with fond memories of the original, misleading and deceiving them with an objectively inferior product. You all knew where this was going. I'm not going to waste time by recounting Disney's new business strategy from the beginning. There's an abundance of videos which cover the same topic in far more detail than I can bring myself to right now, and let's be honest, you probably know about it already. All you really need to know is that after the unexpected success of 2010's Alice in Wonderland, Disney began a highly criticised, highly lucrative business model of remaking all their old animated classics in live action for the big screen and streaming. While it's not exactly the same as the copycat plagiarism between Méliès and Chaumont, the same pointlessness can be felt while watching the majority of these remakes. Recently, as you're probably aware, Disney released the latest of these remakes, Pinocchio, on their streaming platform, a remake of the 1940s classic which is fondly remembered by millions and which was profoundly influential for the Walt Disney Company as their second animated feature film ever produced. It went about as successfully as you can imagine at this point. Criticised for failing to justify its own existence, it was interestingly the first film I thought of when reading about the development of Excursion to the Moon, for more reasons than just its reception. I don't know when was the last time you watched 1940's Pinocchio, but I hope it was recently because this film is great. For real, it's such a technical improvement over Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Disney's first animated feature. So much of this film must have been next to impossible to pull off at the time, with the underwater scenes and the visual and sound design of Monstro coming to mind in particular, not to mention the massive and complex set pieces of Pleasure Island and Stromboli's puppet show. From beginning to end, the film is a gorgeous technical marvel with so much going on under the hood that it must be considered the equivalent of an animated trick film. And all this occurs within its simple framework story which never overstays its welcome or pretends to be more than it is. A simple parable about having a moral conscience is the key to being a good, real person. Plotlines are introduced halfway through or left without a conclusion, characters disappear and then reappear somewhere else with no explanation or backstory. It's very much an and then film, similar to Trip to the Moon. Pinocchio becomes sentient and then gets misled on the way to school, and then performs at Stromboli's show, and then gets captured, and then the Blue Fairy helps him escape, and then he's misled into the coachman's clutches, and so on and so forth. The film's weakest aspect is definitely its narrative. It's nothing to write home about, but it provides a perfect framework to separate each gorgeous set piece clearly, while also being just developed enough to provide a clear central theme and moral. It never tries to be more than it has to be, and the movie, while certainly not perfect, is all the better for it. 82 years later, and Robert Zemeckis decides he can do it better. Zemeckis, the acclaimed director of the Back to the Future trilogy and Forrest Gump, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, The Polar Express, Welcome to Marwen, The Witches. Oh no. Oh no. The movie is bad. It's critically bad, and not in a way that's like there were some production issues, the animation is wonky, but overall it's still a good time. This is more like fundamental structural problems with how the film was conceived and presented to the audience. There is nothing this film does better than the original, not in terms of narrative, not in terms of spectacle. The preliminary building blocks of Pinocchio's character are just broken. The morals of the original are spectacularly misunderstood here. Somehow lying will get you nowhere becomes lying your way out of a situation is key, and no matter how unrelentingly good and saintly and moral you are, you'll still get punished for it because the world is just that shitty of a place. Anything that may somewhat resemble the charm of the original is buried under useless additions which just subtract from the original story. Some of the most striking visuals of the original are just absent, replaced by desperate attempts to connect dots which didn't need connecting in the first place. It's a nothing movie. It has nothing to say, but compensates for this by having nothing to show us either. Not all Disney's remakes are created equal. You can tell that on a rare occasion some do genuinely try to retell the stories with some originality or warranted changes, although it's astonishing to me that we're still finding movie studios floundering over these remakes and making the same mistakes as 100 years ago, misunderstanding the conventions and narratives which made the classic so endearing in the first place. A movie like 1940's Pinocchio, told in the way Disney told it, doesn't benefit from being retold by adding extra bells and whistles. There are ways to retell a Pinocchio story by telling a new adaptation of the original work. We've learned that the result will be far more fulfilling than trying to recapture the magic of what made the original so great. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that all remakes are bad, of course not. Some of the very best movies ever made are remakes of old films, but for every Scarface there's 2 Psychos, for every The Thing there's 5 The Mummies. The point of this video wasn't to decry the very concept of remakes. No, what I really wanted to do here was point out the awkward and interesting negative similarities between one of the first popular remakes ever produced and one of the most recent remakes ever produced. The most successful remakes update the original film and message for a modern audience. They have something new to say through the source material. A remake shouldn't be made to replace the original so much as it should complement it, act as a companion piece to the original so both can be enjoyed and compared as unique experiences rather than one being deemed old and inferior. If you've nothing new to say with an old film, maybe there's no point in remaking it. But you all know this already. The film industry is a business after all, and few decisions are made without considering how it will affect the bottom line. The mainstream film industry found its groove with narrative films in the early 20th century and ran with it. You can say that trickality and theatricality still do exist in technical spectacles with films like Jurassic Park or Avatar, and there's certainly an argument to be made there, but even then, few decisions are made without that monetary mindset. And for the most part, the industry will have its way with those who deviate from the norm, as it did with Méliès himself, as early as the 1910s when Pathé refused to distribute his films any longer. Deemed too artistic, Méliès' career ended woefully, with him stating, "I am only an artist, so be it. That is something. But it is just for that reason that I cannot agree with you. For if you businessmen do not have artists to make films for you, I ask, what can you sell?" Which, in this Gene's opinion, is as true a statement today as it was 100 years ago. Whatever you do, don't think about AI art, okay? Bye!